Jazz is a scary place. And if you want to receive guidance to navigate such a scary place, you usually turn to the internet these days. The other day, I looked for videos entitled Greatest Jazz Albums. And I got about 1.6 million results with that query. Changing that to greatest jazz albums of all time, that was around 900,000. Putting everything in quotation marks reduced this by a factor of about 1,000. And I didn't watch all of those videos. I didn't watch the about 1,000 videos on greatest jazz albums of all time in quotation marks, and I definitely didn't watch all of the greatest jazz albums without quotation marks. But I watched quite a number of them, and they were, all of them, without fail, following a few principles. One of them, they used a number of albums which were multiples of 5. So top 10, top 20, top 25. For which reason? I don't know. Secondly, they assumed a well order within those albums, meaning they either ranked them from worst to best within the best ones, or sorted them chronologically. And finally, there are obviously a few albums that, no matter your taste, no matter what you're trying to tell, you absolutely have to include. These include, for example, Time Out by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, Shape of Jazz to Come by Ornette Coleman, then either A Love Supreme or Giant Steps by John Coltrane, and The Elephant in the Room, Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. They also usually include the Live at Newport by Charlie Parker and the Hot 5 and Hot 7 complete recordings by Louis Armstrong, which doesn't make any sense if we look at albums, because those are compilations. So what you will get today is albums which receive their order from kind of trying to tell a story about albums that I consider the best jazz albums. And best here means albums that mark a significant point in all of that is considered jazz, which may or may not have historical significance. Most of them don't, I think, with maybe one exception, and which also paint a cohesive picture, what I consider relevant. And finally, which are great albums, meaning not a collection of tracks which just happen to be released on an album, but where you can understand why the artist took those tracks and put them together on an LP, on a CD, what have you. So how many are there? Frankly, I don't remember. I have a stack of CDs next to me. Sadly, none of them are on vinyl, and I'm gonna go through them. And I will start with a completely odd one. This is Chamber Music by the Louis Clavis Septet. Louis Clavis, clarinetist and soprano saxophonist, is mostly known as the central figure of the Workshop de Lyon, a group of musicians in France in the Lyon greater area. And interestingly, both on that album and also from what Louis Clavis did in general, those artists usually very much stayed among themselves. Other artists included on that album are Dominique Pifarelli, violinist Michel Godard on tuba, Yves Robert on trombone, etc. And this is, let's say, a strange mixture of post-bebop melodic lines with classical impressionist arrangement forms and combined with at times some almost ambient structures. And what I always considered odd about that album was its title. Why is it called chamber music? In the classical context, you consider chamber music everything where there is not more than one guy playing the same voice. So an orchestra is not chamber music. If you have a string quartet, that's obviously chamber music. If you have a small orchestra with only one first violin, one second violin, etc., that's called a chamber orchestra. Strictly speaking, still chamber music. So in jazz, even in the case of big bands, that's all chamber music, isn't it? And the interesting thing when I was thinking about that, about the reasoning, I came to at one point it really struck me, and I believed, okay, that's why Luis Clavis chose that title. In that septet, you have soprano saxophone, you have trombone, you have tuba, you have electric guitar, you have acoustic piano shared with synthesizer duties. What did I miss? You have double bass, and now I missed someone. Need to look it up. Okay, you have Luis Clavis on clarinet and soprano sax. You have the aforementioned Dominique Pifarelli on violin, Yves Robert on trombone, Michel Godard on tuba, Philippe Deschipper on guitar, François Rollin on piano and keyboards, and Bruno Chevillon on acoustic bass. Notice something? There isn't a drummer. Now, if you went out and let's say you were a movie director and the script said there's a jazz band playing in the background, you would most probably say, okay, I need a double bass, I need an acoustic piano, I need a drum kit, and I need one or two horns, one of them being a saxophone, preferably a tenor saxophone. But you always have a drum kit. And in that context, you have a saxophone, but the wrong kind. And you also have people who pretty much only play with other French people, or maybe with other Western European people like Han Benning or Andreas Willers from Berlin, or another German jazz musician, Peter Brötzmann, who also in the past played in very strange lineups. And it's actually Peter Brötzmann in one of his duet collaborations that I'm gonna pick next. This is Lowlife by Peter Brötzmann and Bill Laswell. The combination here again is not a standard jazz group, but it's a bass saxophone and an electric bass guitar. So what will happen there? You have some very aggressive things which really hurt you emotionally, even though they don't even have a drum kit. But you also have some almost ambient lyrical combinations of Brötzmann's bass saxophone and Laswell's electric bass guitar. You also have some more sparse noise slash musique concrète kind of voicings there. And finally, you have a collaboration between an important but definitely fringe zone artist like Peter Brötzmann and Bill Laswell, who, although he worked both as a producer and a bass guitarist with many great jazz artists, including Herbie Hancock, Future Shock, etc., including Massacre with Fred Frith and Charles Hayward, who is not really a jazz musician. But at least he's not in France. He's part of has always been and continues to be part of the New York scene. And we'll continue with the next album in the New York scene, which usually is identified, although many of those artists come from different towns. Those really big names like Thelonious Monk, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman. And Ornette Coleman is an important name in the context of the next album, although it is not by Ornette Coleman. This is Spy vs. Spy by John Soren, subtitled John Soren, Tim Byrne, Mark Dresser, Michael Vatcher, Joey Barron play the music of Ornette Coleman. And when we say the music of Ornette Coleman, this is focused on those early, really innovative albums, the aforementioned Shape of Jazz to Come, This Is Our Music, and that early area with that famous quartet, which was made up of Ornette Coleman on alto saxophone plus trumpet plus double bass plus drums. In this case, changed to 2 times alto sax, double bass and 2 times drums for a 5-point symmetry. And I chose this album not only because I like the music of Ornette Coleman, that early music, and the work of of John Soren and Tim Byrne and Joey Barron and Michael Vatcher and Mark Dresser, but especially because this is the hardest, most stressful listening experience I ever experienced. And I've been listening to a lot of metalcore, of hardcore musique concrète, the really ugly things, black MIDI, you name it. But this is a stressful experience and really nicely contextualizes those early Ornette Coleman works. And even though this album is already from the 80s, continues to show how innovative and how important those were. Now we're in the New York scene, although not strictly in the jazz scene, because John Soren usually doesn't consider himself a jazz saxophonist, but rather kinda classical / crossover music composer. And we obviously have the New York jazz scene in the US, and like with all the big things, we also have the Los Angeles area scene, but there's another both in hip-hop and in jazz, often underrated scene, and that is Chicago. For example, also home of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. And one of its former members is Henry Threadgill, and here I picked Making a Move. Now, my relationship as a music listener with Henry Threadgill must have been late 90s, late to mid 90s. They played at Bürgerhaus unter Schleißheim, so he played there with his ensemble Very Very Circus, and we continue with the strange lineups, which consisted of a drum kit, 2 tubas, 2 electric guitars, trombone and alto saxophone. Note that we now have 2 alto saxophonists as leaders, but still no tenor saxophone. And that was a memorable experience because that was in deep winter, minus 23 degrees, and I knew I had to wait at the public transport station outside for almost 40 minutes if I stayed for the second encore. That was an easy decision to make. Now, on making a move, this is not only the odd, very, very circus lineup, but on other tracks includes a guitar quartet, a cello trio, and a combination together with a piano and a combination of both, which is odd. And also here the music has kind of that contemporary classical influence, but combines that with a very jazzy, with a very African American groove at some points, which in the end is for that form of art that jazz is, that usually is considered the only truly US based art form, although more on that later if that is really true. And so in all of its details, because there's also the influence of contemporary classical with composers like John Cage, or in the context of jazz, John Lewis, who by the way also did amazing things together with John Zorn. So that's the reasoning for Henry Threadgill and this album, making a move, picking this over many of his other important things. And sticking in Chicago, the third of the three cities, it's not two, but three cities, what better album to pick than A Tale of Three Cities by Steve Coleman. I originally noted Coleman must have been around Rhythm People time, so end of the 90s roughly, end of the 80s, when they performed at Theaterfabrik, which usually was a venue which had a disco/club event catering to young audiences, but also interesting jazz concerts. Incidentally, at that time, the support act was Myra Melford, who also played on the last album. And I really enjoyed that concert, but couldn't get to grips with the album releases by Steve Coleman at that time. And I still stand with that. The album performances of that incarnation, the first incarnation of his 5 elements, didn't live up to the live experience. And that changed with the second incarnation, which the major change being David Gilmour on guitar being more or less replaced by Andy Milne on piano and keyboards, and Marvin Smithy Smith on drums being replaced by Gene Lake, who incidentally also did a lot of work with the aforementioned Henry Threadgill. And on this album, Steve Coleman uses his 5 elements, let's say core formation, together with 2 additional horns, a percussionist, and a number of MCs and vocalists to create, and we're talking 1995 here, what I consider the greatest jazz and hip-hop/rap fusion to this day, which is really a big statement, because, I mean, how long has rap and hip-hop existed? How long has jazz existed? So we're still, I wouldn't say stuck with that album, because this is really a great album. I won't be the judge of that relationship to hip-hop. I'm not a connoisseur in that realm, but I definitely can state this is a great jazz album with rap and hip-hop elements. Now, why did it take so long to create that, let's say, interesting fusion? After all, there were other artists who were always open to explore the boundaries between jazz and other art forms in music. And obviously, we're talking about the elephant in the room and what has been known as jazz fusion, which during the times has become a derogatory term, can be argued where it started, but many critics, many music scientists, whatever you may call them, would pick this album, Miles Davis in a Silent Way. And I'm gonna pick this myself, also for several reasons. And one of them is really the lineup. In addition to Miles Davis, obviously, you have 3 keyboard players. You have Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, Joe Zawinul. You have Wayne Shorter, only on soprano saxophone. No, he also plays tenor. He only plays tenor. Okay, let's say Wayne Shorter on saxophone. You have Dave Halen on acoustic bass, John McLaughlin on guitar, and Tony Williams on drums. In other words, all of the big names of 70s fusion continuing into the 80s either were on that album or were part of the groups that the people on this album were about to found. After this album, pretty quickly, Herbie Hancock started a string of albums which included the very famous Headhunters, which I'm not including here, Sextant, which I like much better. Chick Corea founded Return to Forever, including many important fusion musicians during that time. To pick but 2, Stanley Clarke and help me out here, Al Di Meola. Then Wayne Shorter, together with Joe Zawinul, founded Weather Report, which included, among others, the ever-present Jaco Pastorius, John McLaughlin, Mahavishnu Orchestra, which would include Billy Cobham on drums and Jan Hammer on keyboards, and finally Tony Williams with his Lifetime. But what about the music here? Strangely, although considered the start of fusion/rock jazz, this album does not rock. In fact, it is much more subdued, much more ambient than really most of the jazz albums I know. And this is something that changed with the following live and also studio albums by Miles Davis during the 70s, before moving back to that on the closing tracks of his last 2 recordings during that period, which were only released much later, Agatha and Pangaea, and which, to make a link to the pretty much the beginning of this video, made the foundation for the Panther Lasso remixes by Miles Davis. And independently of what that mean to rock jazz, I already said all of those people went on to found really important jazz fusion groups, with the exception of Dave Holland, who would continue to play a fantastic live album with Herbie Hancock, with Pat Metheny, and with Jack DeJohnette later on, called Parallel Realities. One of those big pianists of that era in jazz is missing here, who incidentally also didn't become famous as a fusion rock jazz pianist. He would continue to play on later Miles Davis albums from that period, most notably the film Live at Fillmore West double album. But most of the time he had been famous for his solo piano work, which a lot of the time is really boring, and for his quartets and for his really long-running trio. And for that reason, I'm going to pick Up For It by the So it's credited to Keith Jarrett, Gary Peacock, and Jack DeJohnette, usually known as also as the Keith Jarrett Trio. And there's pretty much 3 reasons why I picked that. One of them, this is an outstanding trio album. And finally, after all that stuff we had, like bass saxophone and electric bass guitar duo, alto sax, French horn, 2 electric guitars, 2 tubas and drums, and all those strange lineups, this is for the first time in this video a proper jazz lineup, meaning acoustic piano, double bass, and drum kit. And it's great music, and I really also like the story that we hear from the liner notes. Apparently this was recorded at, I think, the Juan Letin festival. Let's look that up. The Pinigou Juan Lepin, incidentally in France, so we're somehow returning to France with this. And Keith Jarrett describes that their appearance here was pretty much a group of 3 old sick men preparing to play a concert. And then the presenter also had done something wrong. Water had gotten into the piano and other things had happened. So he would have legally been allowed to just say, we're not going to play here. The weather was terrible. Those old men were not feeling well. And then they said, yeah, are we gonna play this? And Keith Jarrett went out and saw the sun coming out behind the hills during the terrible rainy weather, and turned to his band and said, okay, do you think we're up for it? And they agreed they were, and played a fantastic jazz trio performance, playing standards all the way. If I Were a Bell, My Funny Valentine, Someday My Prince Will Come, and closing this off with an original. And in that context, this is also really important, because trios, be it in rock, be it in jazz, not so much in classical music, is really a hugely strong formation. You don't have too many players, but you have enough players to at least be able to fill some gaps. And this is especially important, the former one, if you're playing improvised music. And we'll stick with trios, and we'll stick with the final reason why I picked this album, because it has my favorite jazz drummer of all time on it, and pick another trio album, albeit a completely different one. This is John Abercrombie's solo debut, Timeless, also like the preceding one on ECM Records, and it features Jan Hammer on organ, synthesizer and piano, and Jack DeJohnette on drums, as I said. From 1974, this is, let's say, again differently to what in fusion rock jazz artists like Herbie Hancock or Weather Report or the Mahavishnu Orchestra or Return to Forever did. This has a very, let's say, subtle and gentle, but still very energetic vibe to it. And the fact that you only have 3 musicians, one of them Jan Hammer, due to playing organ most of the time, being able to play both harmony parts and bass lines at the same time properly. This is, let's say, a vastly underrated and surprisingly great album. And in that context, the title track alone is, to me, worth the price of admission. And because the title track, which ends the album, is so great, there's another artist from that 70s ECM sphere. We are switching music scenes again. We had returned to New York with Miles Davis before moving to ECM Records, although all of the musicians on Up For It were from the US, and most of them from Gateway, that is ECM, Munich, Germany, and it stands for a very specific sound and artistic concept in jazz that some people like me like, others completely hate, but more on that later. And the next one is also an artist that has for most of his performance career been associated with that label. And incidentally, this is a live recording and a solo performance. So moving through different lineups, we're now with a solo artist, but not a pianist, which would be the usual thing to do, but an acoustic guitarist. And I'm talking, of course, about Rolf Tauner's concert 1978 in the America House in Munich, which I did attend as a small child and reportedly didn't like as much as Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy's violin concerto, which, to be honest, I still prefer a little bit. But this doesn't keep me from taking Solo Concert by Rolf Tauner as my next pick, which also ends with the track Timeless, which is a wonderful rendition. It has Nardis on it, all of that, a very, let's say, just like the album before, a very subdued and very delicate kind of music, but with energy in the right way. Now, sticking with ECM Records for another album and with somewhat out of the mainstream artists, the next album also has Rolf Tauner on it and another great guitarist from, let's say, that general area. So far, we've been looking at Europe, we've been looking at the US, but we haven't looked at South America, even though with Afro-Cuban influences, and on the other hand, we've hinted at that with Return to Forever, with Brazilian influences. This also can be considered an important part of jazz. However, the next one is neither of that. We'll pick Alberto Gismonti and Soji Meogio. Just like Tauner, Alberto Gismonti is originally a pianist who later moved to acoustic guitar, although in that case not acoustic, that is something they share with both Michael Neely and Eddie Van Halen. And on this album, which was very much inspired by his studies with Native Americans in Brazil in the Amazon region, and combining that with both his classical and jazz influences, he amassed a group of Nana Vasconcelos and Colin Walcott, two percussionists. Then you have Alberto Gismonti and Rolf Tauner on acoustic guitar, and finally Jan Gabarek on saxophone. Now, differently to the albums we've had so far, this album, Soji Meogio, has at some points during, let's say, around the midpoint, definitely some weaknesses where I believe that the individual components of the sound don't gel that well. However, the remainder of the album, especially the opening track and the closing suite, consisting of a total of 4 tracks, clocking in at about 25 minutes, are both stunning. And also when it comes to pieces in jazz which are like 25 minutes long, I'll be hard tempted to find a better example. Now, we moved through 4 ECM albums in a row, and this will very well become the, let's say, most important label in that video. And I'm gonna stick with that, because looking back at, for example, Alberto Gismonti, one of his albums that I also really enjoy is Alberto Gismonti and Charlie Hayden in Montreal. We already had an indirect reference to Charlie Hayden before, as he was the big double bass player in Ornette Coleman's original quartet. He also was for a long time an ECM recording artist who also combined this US American and European influences in his work. And finally, there's also a very important link to South America, where we are currently residing with Alberto Gismonti. Now, for the next one, I'm not going to pick up a CD, but a piece of paper, because I can't for the life of me find the copy of that album. This is Ballad of the Fallen, credited to Charlie Hayden, although I would believe you could pretty well also credit that to Carla Bley and Charlie Hayden, or even only to Carla Bley. Now, just like with John Soren before, Carla Bley is another artist who identifies more as a composer than as a performer. She was specifically quoted at being 99% composer, 1% pianist. And a lot of her work in jazz was also simply writing for other artists. To quote Gary Burton, perhaps the most important vibraphone player in modern jazz, who pretty much said, yeah, I could very well do an album with all original tunes, and that would be okay, but it wouldn't be great. So I work with great composers like Steve Swallow, like Pat Metheny, and of course with Carla Bley. Some of his albums were written by Carla Bley entirely. But I digress. Ballad of the Fallen is an album with sometimes traditional or folk song, let's say composed folk songs, elements from South America, performed by Charlie Hayden's Liberation Music Orchestra, and which I believe this was the second album by that group after the self-titled first one, and again has a wonderful combination of composed material with improvised aspects. I find it usually very hard, both with regard to how that music works and also how the usual musicians think there, to listen to large ensemble improvisations. There's a reason why Ascension, an album that I otherwise really like, didn't make it onto this list, and spoilers, it won't appear as the next one. And the next one, by the way, will be the last one. The same is true for Free Jazz by Ornette Coleman. That ensemble is too large to work in a typical jazz context. Now, Miles Davis, for example, for his larger groups, larger than, say, In a Silent Way, did work with Jill Evans, but his style of composing and leading a band, to me, did put too much shackles on the performers and how then the music would develop. And this, to me, is the key strength of that album and of Carla Bley as a composer. And so when it comes to music with an extra musical narrative in jazz, to large ensemble improvised music, that Ballad of the Fallen is really the one to go. In the context of Carla Bley, we have moved yet slightly to yet another group of musicians, to another pool, to another scene, even though this is again New York scene. You have artists like Paul Motion, like Michael Mantler, like Paul Bley, obviously. You have Gary Valenti. You have, what's the name of that trombonist that you also played with Jill Evans? David Bargeron. And you have Lew Soloff, also of Blood, Sweat and Tears fame, and Ray Anderson. And we had saxophone. We actually had 3 saxophone players as leaders so far. We had pianists, we had guitarists, we had trumpet player, we had a double bass player. We didn't have drummer as a leader, but we didn't have a trombone. So the only trombone that appeared was Gary Valenti's on Ballad of the Fallen. And also, when we look at the history of jazz, which I need to look at the proving monitor here, which goes about from here to here. This is the start, this is the end, this is today. We've been looking at around that region, 1996 in a sound way to around 1997, I think, or 1998. So I'm gonna pick something that's still from that region, but references clearly an era much earlier. We're not talking about bebop, although that would also be a nice idea, news for Lulu, but I digress. We're not talking about swing, we're not talking about Louis Armstrong, etc. We are talking about the really early New Orleans street marching bands context. And for that, I picked Ray Anderson, Where Home Is, which is what he called his pocket brass band, with Lew Soloff, Matt Perrin on sousaphone, and Bobby Previtt, who in other contexts is known for some pretty outrageous avant-garde stuff, again from the New York scene. And what he plays here is New Orleans inspired work with his usual voice that he has as an important jazz trombone player of that era, and closes this off with a track by Scott Joplin to even move farther back into ragtime. He quotes Duke Ellington and the Thelonious Monk composition. So this Where Home Is really rounds this off for me, also to take care of the early influences in jazz and is a really comfortable listening experience, differently to Ballad of the Fallen, let alone Spy vs. Spy. So that's my list of the greatest jazz albums of all time. There are many, many more that I could have put on to this list, but I won't do that. How many were those? I believe 13, maybe 12. It wasn't 10, it wasn't 15. And I did tell a story. And those are all great albums. Go and check them out. By the way, reportedly due to Rick Beato's nagging, ECM Records has finally stopped blocking content on YouTube. So you really have a good chance to listen to all of those here on YouTube. Enjoy!